Welcome. I'm Kara Marcus, Resource Center Manager for National RTAPs, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Building Better Bus Stops, Planning and Partnerships. We have some housekeeping before we get started. So this is going to be a really great webinar. So excited that you're all able to be here. You can ask questions or share comments in the chat throughout the webinar. During the presentation portion, you will be muted. Please continue to keep yourself muted while the panelists are presenting. During the question and answer portion at the end, you may raise your hand and you will be called upon to unmute yourself to ask a question or share a comment. First, we'll go through all the questions that were asked in writing during the webinar itself, and then we hopefully will have time for some verbal comments. Please note that this webinar will include questions about planning and partnerships of building better bus stops. And the panelists will not address specific ADA technical specifications. If you have questions about that, you can ask them to FTA. The slides and a recording of the presentation will be posted to our webinars page on the nationalrtap.org site. You will also receive a brief survey tomorrow to give us feedback about this webinar and to help us improve future webinars. So you're probably all familiar with Zoom at this point, but you are welcome to chat with us. You can show your video and there's audio. If you want, you can use your computer audio or your phone audio, but please stay muted during the presentation part. If you have technical difficulties, please use chat and we'll do our best to help you with that. Now, a little bit about us if you're not familiar with us. National Rural Transit Assistance Program, National RTAP, is a technical assistance center funded by Federal Transit Administration, FTA, through the Section 5311 Rural Formula Funding Program. We provide free training materials and technical assistance, such as this webinar, to rural and tribal transit providers and to state RTAPs. We're governed by a review board, which is composed of 14 state DOT and rural and tribal transit agency staff from across the country. Through the end of March, we're soliciting nominations for new members. You can visit our news page if you're interested in becoming part of National RTAP in this way. Our website is easy, nationalrtap.org. And here's a screenshot. Another library that National RTAP runs is TACL, the Transportation Technical Assistance Coordination Library. TACL is composed of FTA and its TA centers. I'm not going to read them all, but if you go to transportation-tackle.org, you'll find links to each of the TA centers as well as FTA and many other resources about planning and partnerships, because that's what transportation coordination is all about. Now, you're in for a real treat today, because if you want to build better bus stops, we've assembled some of the industry leaders, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them and then turn it over to this panel. We hope that you, as participants in this webinar, do go on to build better bus stops. And if you do, please get back in touch with us and tell us how this inspired you and what you've done. The email, and it'll be at the end of the webinar too, is info@nationalrtap.org. So our first panelist is Andy Batson. He's the Chief of Planning and Project Delivery within PennDOT Bureau of Public Transportation. Andy is responsible for leading statewide transit planning and technology projects, as well as delivering an annual capital program of more than $500 million. Andy previously served as the Division Chief for Urban Transportation, led a multimodal transportation planning group, and in a private consulting firm. Our next panelist, Natasha Mannbeck, is Senior Project Manager for McMahon Associates, Inc., with almost 20 years of experience in transportation planning and design. Natasha leads a broad range of transportation plans, feasibility evaluations, and conceptual design projects that involve the coordination of land use and transportation systems. As both a licensed engineer and a certified planner, she has a passion for working with communities to improve walking, biking, and of course, transit. Natasha oversaw development of the Building Better Bus Stops resource guide for Pennsylvania Public Transportation Association, PPTA, and PennDOT. Our final panelist, Rich Schlameuss, has served as the Assistant Executive Director of the Monroe County Transit Authority, MCTA, also known as the Pocono Pony, in Northeast Pennsylvania since 2008. Rich, who specializes in transit technology, has focused on the installation and implementation of customer amenities such as sheltered bus stops and easily accessible real-time information. In 2022, Rich will oversee the installation of additional bus shelters, digital e-ink signs with real-time bus arrivals, and bike racks, as well as preparing and enacting a comprehensive marketing plan focusing on increasing ridership and enhancing communications with staff and with the public. Now, I'm sure you are as excited as I am to hear this presentation, so I will turn it over to our panelists who will share screen and get you started on building better bus stops.
All right, thank you, Kara. I'll kick it off. Welcome, everyone. We're really excited to share this resource guide with you here today, and hope that you take away from something from it, and that we can hear a little bit more about things you're doing in your area that can help inform this in the future. Next slide, please, Natasha. So this Building Better Bus Stops resource guide really came out of the Pennsylvania Public Transportation Association. You heard of that. That's our state association here in Pennsylvania, and their planning committee. And they had been talking for a long time about this need to have guidance and resources for agencies to work with their partners to have better bus stops in their communities. I think in recent years, we've really seen there being an increased interest in improved access to transit, whether that be through bicycles or pedestrians. And a lot of those, really rotate around the bus stops and the bus shelters and how we get safely to those assets, excuse me. So, we noticed we did this whole scan, which Natasha will talk about. Really, there was limited bus stop guidance resources out there. It really focused on the larger organizations, places like SEPTA, which is Philadelphia's transit agency, and the Port Authority of Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh's. And nationally, a lot of those larger transit agencies really have great resources on how to build and design bus stops. We really don't have that in more of the rural and suburban areas. And that's really what this resource guide was attempting to do. And as you can see, we stepped up with PennDOT and our partners at the Pennsylvania Public Transportation Association to develop this resource guide that we're going to talk to you about today. Next slide for me. All right. So really is a resource guide. It's tools and best practices. It's not requirements. We didn't want to develop something that would be prescriptive or something that would be a you must do or you have to do, but it was a collection of tools, best practices, and resources that people can use to better plan and implement bus stops. As we talked about, it was PennDOT and PPTA, and it really covers three main portions of it. It talks about planning and design of those fixed route bus stops, excuse me. It also talks about how to better work with municipal and county officials and how to incorporate those things into planning and implementation ordinances, which Natasha will go into in greater detail. And as you can see, those links on the bottom, which I'm sure will be provided in the chat box for those of you who are interested in accessing those resources. So next slide. I think this is where Natasha will take over, but I just want to say as a state DOTs normally don't get involved in these types of things, but I can tell you that we're really excited to partner with transit agencies in the rural and suburban areas in our state to help really provide better access to public transportation. We know how important it is. The pandemic certainly threw things a little bit into a tailspin, but we're seeing ridership rebound, we're seeing needs change, but really people always need to be able to get safely and efficiently to those bus stops. And we're looking forward to doing that here and in the future. So I'll turn it over to Natasha now.
Great. Thanks, Andy. I did include the link to the Building Better Bus Stop page on the PPTA website in the chat. So you have that link. And that's probably the best place. The guide is available also on PennDOT's website, but I think going to the PPTA website has a whole host of information and resources. So use that link. So our team that developed the guide, we conducted both statewide as well as national research on technical bus stop design guidelines and requirements and best practices. We've reviewed some other kind of statewide guides, for example, from Rhode Island and Maryland and Florida. And again, those are some great guides that are out there, as well as several TCRP reports and FTA circulars. And a plug, we also contacted the RTAP resource library and technical assistance and gathered some information on guides that had already been prepared for more rural communities. So while this guide was developed for Pennsylvania, it is based on insights from existing guides and best practices from across the country. And also, if you know anything about Pennsylvania, we have a lot of different landscapes that I think translate well to other communities across the nation. So we think that some of the resources will be helpful for your communities. So many bus stops across the country look like the images on these slides. Simply a sign on the side of the road that is sometimes hard to see, so I have to put a red circle so you know where the bus stop is located. They lack sidewalks and crosswalks, making it difficult to safely walk to or from the bus stop. And there's often limited space and supportive infrastructure for waiting passengers. They're really located in transitional areas, kind of on the roadway edge, kind of within the adjacent land uses. And it becomes a great challenge with the physical constraints and existing conditions. However, we know that enhanced bus stops are relatively low cost and can have a significant impact on ridership, on safety, accessibility, and overall transit operations. So the guide really provides some tools to improve bus stop and so that they can become gateways for transit agencies, community assets, even public gathering spaces. So while the existing conditions can be challenging, one of the other challenges with bus stops is the coordination and approval processes that may be required. I have a picture of Hercules because sometimes it feels like it's a Herculean effort to make a bus stop improvement. And I think one of the issues is that the requirements could be different for each stop. They might depend on the location of the stop. So could be local zoning ordinance requirements or specific state DOT requirements. They might be different based on the type of improvements for the bus stop. So a shelter might require a specific building permit or maintenance agreement, may depend on the funding sources. If you're going to use federal funds, you will have to follow NEPA and potentially Section 106. And I can tell you, as both a planner and engineer, it is overwhelming and sometimes difficult to navigate all these requirements. And so if you're not dealing with them on a regular basis and they may be outside of your areas of expertise, it can be even more complex and challenging. So we hope that the resource guide gives you some strategies to help overcome some of these challenges and proactively plan for bus stops. Interagency coordination and partnerships are needed and essential for successful planning and design of bus stops. Andy and I say it really takes a village. And I think it's important to understand the roles and responsibilities up front, so you know that everyone can be at the table who needs to be and involved throughout the planning and design process. So public transit agencies, they're really key. They're the ones operating the service and are often responsible for where a bus stop is located and the sign and what it might look like. Municipalities and counties often control land use and community design. State DOTs play a key role, both in overseeing capital and operating funds for transit as well as roadway improvements. MPOs, or metropolitan planning organizations, often work collaboratively with the transit agencies and DOTs on long-range plans and programming federal and state funds, which can be critical resource for bus stop improvements. Developers, planners, and engineers are the ones who put those plans into work and help to transform public places. And they are essential for the design of bus stop improvements. And community members, particularly transit riders who know which bus stops need those improvements, can help to advocate for them. I think it's important to recognize that everyone has a role to play, and we need everyone at the table and working together in order to be successful. So now that we've given you a little bit of background information, I'm going to present an overview of the Building Better Bus Stops resource guide. It is organized into 3 parts. Part 1 is planning and policy resources. Part 2 is design resources. Part 3 is bus stop typologies. And I will mention that the guide is pretty dense and long. And so we developed a quick reference, a 10-page summary. So if you want the Reader's Digest version, go to the website and look for the quick reference. It's a great overview and hopefully a document that you could share potentially with some of your partners to get them interested in bus stops. So I'm going to start with part 1, which is the planning and policy resources. Part 1 is really geared for transit agencies as well as the municipalities, the ones involved with upfront land use decisions and plans. So like all modes of transportation, public transit, it's all about the people, and public transit inherently links the people it serves to the places they want to go. And I think it's important that transit is really heavily influenced by many aspects of land use, including density and design. And municipalities, who often control land use and make those decisions, can help to encourage development and design that fosters public transportation. And that has and can provide a number of community benefits. So by incorporating transit into municipal plans, the municipalities can really take an upfront role in addressing some of the transportation needs of their citizens and their communities. So for the transit agency representatives that may be on the call, I'm sure many of you have gotten a call after a new warehouse has been built or a new commercial center has been constructed. And, the owner or another representative is having issues with their employees getting to work and say, can you serve this new development? And what happens is oftentimes the site plan, the development was not designed or developed with the thought of transit. And it's very difficult to serve that location efficiently and effectively. So one of the ideas of the resource guide is to not have transit be an afterthought, but rather have it be part of the upfront planning process. So transit can be incorporated into some of the fundamental plans that municipalities develop, including comprehensive plans, zoning ordinances, subdivision and land development ordinances, official maps, and there's a host of other plans, even plans that you might not always think transit could play a part of, such as an open space plan. I think it's important that transit can be considered in a variety of plans. The guide includes steps for incorporating transit into those plans at every step in the evaluation process. So most plans start by evaluating some existing conditions. And there it's important to think about where you have existing stops and routes, but also what areas might not be served. Where are there some vulnerable populations or key new destinations emerging? That will feed into identifying future needs and where transit may be needed in the future and how land use can help to support those future transit operations. And lastly, the development of recommendations. And so I think part of this is making sure that municipalities and transit agencies are working together, even if it's on small parts of broader plans to incorporate transit. The resource guide also summarizes some best practices for transit supportive land use and design, and it includes concepts such as focusing growth along existing transit routes, requiring pedestrian networks within sites, and even reducing parking minimums to encourage transit ridership. I recognize that Hugh Mose, I think, is on the call. He provided the images here and was really a leader at CATA, which operates in the State College area of Pennsylvania. And he formed a partnership with the Regional Planning Agency over the past, for over 20 years. And I think one of the strategies that was really impressive is that the two entities shared and supported a transit planner position. And the planner was responsible for reviewing land development plans that were within the transit area, and it resulted in bus stop infrastructure and pedestrian connections that are shown on these images. Those were incorporated into the land use and land development plans because of that planner position, having the opportunity to review plans up front and provide comments based on the transit agency's interests and needs. Land development and design can also impact the efficiency and quality of transit service. So as shown on the image on the left, things like building orientation, reducing setbacks, and providing pedestrian connections can allow buses to continue to operate on the main corridor without diverting into every separate land use. And these images came from a guide developed by Lanta in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. And Lanta has a memorandum of understanding with their MPO to share municipal plans and land development plans, again, to ensure that transit is considered upfront. So you can see how these are two examples of great partnerships that have resulted in improved bus stops. So one of the resources in the guide is model ordinance language for zoning and subdivision and land development. And I will say this is one area I was somewhat surprised when developing the guide. As part of our national research, we didn't find any other model ordinance language. So maybe it's out there, but we didn't see it. So we decided to develop it. And it includes clear definitions for common elements of bus stops. And I think having clear definitions is really important because a lot of people don't work with bus stops or design them or plan them on a regular basis. And so it's important that everyone is speaking the same language so that the improvements are what's needed for the community. The model ordinance language also includes guidance related to the location and design of bus stops. One important thing was requiring coordination with transit agencies. and some other requirements related to agreements and having permits in place for both installation and maintenance. The model ordinance is really a starting point. It would need to be modified and tailored to the specific needs of a community, but it's a great foundation to both permit and encourage bus stop infrastructure in appropriate locations. The guide also includes a 6-page plan review checklist that reflects some of the requirements included in the model ordinance, and it can be used by municipalities as well as designers and others to evaluate whether a bus stop should be considered and what design plans should incorporate. I will note here that SEPTA utilized this plan review checklist and customized it for their own needs and is using that for coordination with municipalities. So feel free to take a look at the checklist and see how it might help your communities. So, throughout development of the guide, a lot of people would say, well, it's great to have plans, but I want to implement the improvements. And how do we get improvements implemented? One of the keys is having some funding. And the good news is that I think there's funding available from many of the traditional sources, such as federal funds through FTA. A lot of state DOTs have funding resources available, as well as MPOs may have some competitive or other specific funding resources. I also think this is an opportunity to get creative and think about your partners. I list here the AARP Community Challenge. So this is a broad-based small community grant program, and bus stop improvements have been awarded to transit agencies and communities in the past. And so this is a great opportunity to find new funding sources, whether it be for recreation or public art or other things, and find partnerships where you can create a really great bus stop. I think Rich and Andy and I would agree that while funding is often a hurdle, it isn't the only one, and it maybe isn't the biggest one. You could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have committed time and people resources, you will not get your bus stops implemented. You need people like Rich and Andy and Hugh, and you need people at all levels to be involved and engaged. Many of the success stories that we heard about across the state of Pennsylvania related back to the dedication of a champion, someone who was tireless, who was committed, and who was going to see the bus stop through to the end. So I think it's important that you think about who that might be within your organization, but also think about who the champions might be at your partner organizations that can help you through that complicated approval process. One of the most efficient and effective ways really to implement bus stops is to implement them and integrate them as part of other projects. So for state DOTs, they're often doing roadway improvement projects, and it's a great opportunity to just have a bus stop improved and implemented as part of a broader roadway improvement project. Additionally, I've mentioned a number of land development partnerships. So the top image is from a bus shelter that was installed as part of a land development project. And that was at no cost to the municipality and at no cost to the transit agency. And it results, I think, in a pretty nice looking bus stop and bus shelter. The bottom image is an example of a public-private partnership. And again, this is where you can get your creative juices flowing. The shelter was purchased by a Rotary Club. You can, if you look closely, you can see the Rotary Club logo on the shelter, and it was donated, but the municipality agreed to the ongoing maintenance of that shelter. So again, this is an example of where some, local nonprofit funds were utilized, but also the government partners came to the table. So I'm going to turn it over to Rich to talk about some of the lessons learned and insights from the real world of improving bus stops in rural communities.
Thank you, Natasha. As Natasha mentioned, getting the money is really a small part of the battle. In Pennsylvania, we're a small box state, so every inch of land has a municipality tied to it as a township or borough or city. So the transit authority has to work with all sorts of other entities in order to get shelters in areas, especially in rural areas where we don't have sidewalks, curbs, and other amenities that go to the bus stop. So the demonstration that I have here is at a Pocono Country Place. It's a huge 5,000 building structure, gated community. So people are not allowed in without having a pass or being an owner to the property or a renter. And what happens is our buses are not permitted to go into the gated community. The furthest point from the bus stop in housing could be about 3 miles away, is actually more like 4 miles away from the bus stop. But our buses are not permitted to get in. So people have to walk out to the bus in order to catch it. Some of these areas are also very low income. So the best that we could do with this community was put in a bus shelter that was on the land that's owned by the Pocono Country Place, but not along the state highway 196, because there's no sidewalks, there's no connection to anything else that makes it ADA accessible. So we used a smaller shelter size with some solar lighting, but as you see during the summer and fall there, it's the same shelter, just one is completely covered in the trees, because they said that's where your bus shelter can go. And then during the winter, there is some opportunity for solar lighting there. This is one of our bigger bus stops because it's very close to all the buildings in our area, or in this area. There are a lot of people who walk out to the shelter. So what I'm demonstrating here is it took 3 or 4 different partners in order to get the shelter put in. Getting it put in was the easy part. Just getting the coordination between the community association and then the township, which then has its own permitting and regulations to go with it, and along with PennDOT, it made it very complicated to get even this done. We don't own the property, so we don't have the responsibility of repairing potholes or whatever, but just trying to get them to do it is a complicated thing. And we will even go out and add more stone to these potholes just to fix them up, because our bus actually turns into this area. Natasha, if you want to go to the next slide. The shelter at Pocono Country Place, JKL Gate there had been 2 previous bus shelters there. They've been taken out by automobiles. So make sure you have good insurance on your shelters, because in some cases they will be removed by automobiles. It's shocking to me that even one of them was taken out, but because it's not very close to the road. But again, one of our more populated stops, there's a closed gate nearby and across the street. So my point there is make sure you have some good insurance on these things. The bus shelter at the Stroud Mall is the one that you see with the purple bus. That required 4 different property owners to sign off on the shelter. The shelter most of it is on the property or a piece of it is on the property for the Stroud Mall. Then there's an easement that's available, or that was made for the roadway behind it. Several different people live back that way, so we needed to get several sign-offs just to put in the bus shelter there. That was very complicated. The township was very amenable to having the shelter there. They were very happy to have it there. It took about 3 years to get. Oh, and the other piece of this was that there's a bank that's involved, because the property that the easement is on was in foreclosure. So it took 2 to 3 years just to get all the proper sign-offs for us to be able to put the shelter in. a lot of work goes into this. There's a lot of different people you need to contact. And when you have 20 municipalities to deal with in your community, in order to get every shelter put in, some municipalities require you to have the right permits and pay for them. Others are a little more lenient. And it's really complicated. One of the great things about this exercise that Natasha and Andy worked on here is it gave us the tools to give the municipalities and say, here you go. Here are the resources you need to do to update your model or to update your ordinance to permit bus shelters in your community. We've also worked with the county to make sure that our services are included in their saldo. So when the county reviews a plan, they're asking about, is the property in a public transit area? Is there a service or expected a bus stop there? And have they contacted us to talk about that service? And so it's nice when we get a land development plan come into us and say, hey, yeah, that's a place that we can work with and develop a shelter there. So thank you, Natasha.
Great, thanks, Rich. So hopefully, although, Rich's real world experiences tell you and confirm that it's not necessarily easy, I think he also ended on a positive note that resources in this guide and other guides can be really helpful, especially for building those partnerships and working together. So part 2 of the guide, which I'm now going to focus on, is design resources. So this is geared more towards transit agencies, state DOTs, municipalities, as well as developers and engineers who are involved in the design of streets and development sites and other transportation infrastructure. Bus stop designs should be developed through coordination, always with the transit agency, the owner of the roadway, and the adjacent property owner, if applicable. Bus stop design directly impacts transportation riders in terms of accessibility, safety, comfort, and convenience. But just like planning, it also impacts the quality and efficiency and cost effectiveness of public transit operations. Each bus stop is unique, and the design must consider the site specific context and who are the potential users, what is the roadway and roadside features, and what is the land use context. So the guide includes some steps for planning and designing a bus stop at a high level, starting with identifying whether there's the potential for either a new or improved stop. And that can come from a community request or from when there is a transportation improvement project along the transit route or a land development project nearby. And it's, I think, important to start that evaluation process by coordinating with the transit agency. And the transit agency has important decisions to make as to whether that is an appropriate stop or maybe a future stop and what the design might be. The guide notes that even if it may not be a stop now, there are ways to plan for a future stop. And that could be as simple as reserving some right-of-way or providing the pedestrian infrastructure. So provide the sidewalk connection along the main corridor so that a bus stop could be provided in the future if conditions or the route might change. The design process really involves close coordination between the transit agency, municipality, and the roadway owner, as well as adjacent property owners. And it involves determining where the bus stop is going to be placed, how it will be configured, some of the key elements, which I'm going to talk through as part of the presentation. Also, it's important to understand what permits or approvals might be necessary, not only to install the bus stop improvements, but also for ongoing maintenance. The guide touches on evaluating bus stop locations, and there are a lot of factors to consider, including the existing pedestrian connections, the demographics and potential riders, and the impacts to on-street parking. One of the things I want to emphasize is that a number of the graphics you'll see in the guide and in this presentation focus on one singular bus stop. But bus stops are like shoes and work in pairs. And so you need to think about not only the person who's getting on or off at that stop, but their return trip, which will be across, most likely often across the street. And you have to think about how they'll get from one side of the street to the other. There are a number of other siting and design considerations. So this guide was based on a very common bus stop size of 35 to 40. And so we have a number of dimensions in the guide that are based on that, but it could be modified based on the size of the transit vehicle that's operating. And again, that's why it's important to coordinate with the transit agency. The resource guide provides information and best practices for a host of other consideration, everything from driveways and site distance to pavement markings, traffic signals, and even roundabouts. Retrofitting and improving bus stops is not simple or basic, and it really requires evaluation of existing conditions and creative design solutions. So first, I want to just touch on some of the bus stop design basics. It includes first placement, which is where is the bus stop located with respect to an intersection. There are three basic options. First is far side, which is after proceeding through an intersection, near side, which is before an intersection, and mid-block is in between. Bus stops can also be placed off a public roadway and within a site, and that is covered specifically in the guide. Far sides are typically preferred by many transit agencies because they have minimal conflicts with other vehicles, and pedestrians are encouraged typically to cross behind. Near side stops are sometimes appropriate if they're located at a key generator or where a bus stop might be making a right turn. Mid-block are used most often where there might be feasibility issues with a near side or a far side stop, and primarily when they're at a key generator. And I will say mid-block are often common in more rural communities where the bus stop, you want it to be close to the destinations or origins for your transit riders. There are several types of bus stop configuration options. So the configuration impacts how the rider will get on and off the bus, and also how the stop integrates with the roadway and the streetscape and the surrounding environment. On the left are curbside or roadside stops, which could be in a travel lane, a parking lane, or on a shoulder, and those are the most common type of bus stop configurations. Key considerations for roadside stops include the length of curb or space that might be available without obstructions, pedestrian access, traffic volumes, and speeds. Curb extensions or bulb outs have an extension of the curb and a wider sidewalk, and you can see from the image in the center that this provides often some additional space for bus stop amenities such as a shelter or a bench. It also eases transit operations and makes it easier for the bus driver to pull the bus to the curb. However, the bus often will stop within the travel lane, and that can sometimes cause traffic delays. Lastly, on the right is an example of a bus bay, which is also called a turnout or a pull out. And it includes a designated area for the bus stop that doesn't block the travel lane. And this is typically used on roadways with higher volumes or speeds, or where there might be a longer dwell time for the bus. Some of the concerns with this type of design are the ability of the bus to re-enter traffic. And also it can impact in locations where there's parking, the amount of on-street parking that can be provided. This slide highlights some of the basic elements of a bus stop. And again, this shows one side, but you have to think about the paired bus stop. So I'll just touch on a couple of the key elements. So first is the ADA loading pad. That is a place where the front door and the transit vehicle can deploy the ramp to allow for passengers to board and alight. All bus stops have an information sign that includes route information and the transit agency, and often a stop ID. There are a variety of amenities that can be provided at a bus stop. Not every bus stop needs a shelter or a bench, but sometimes it is warranted based on ridership and other conditions. Other amenities could include bicycle parking, lighting, and trash receptacles. It's important that as you have your build your basic elements, that you think about how people will get to and from the elements of the bus stop. So that includes an accessible route between the ADA loading pad and the shelter, an accessible route through the stop, as well as thinking about often the rear door and having a clear zone for people to get on and off the bus at the rear of the vehicle. So I've already touched on a number of the other amenities. This image, I think, on this slide is inspirational. It includes a play bus stop that was constructed in the city of York. And this was, again, a partnership and had some private nonprofit grant funding. And you can see that they installed some playground equipment at the bus stop so that it became not only a place to catch the bus, but also a community gathering space.
Natasha, I did want to add on to that image you have there. I did learn the other day that that's actually in partnership with the local healthcare center. So they have initiated an entire shelter program to install these play shelters in areas of high ridership where they know there are communities with lots of children, to encourage active play in partnership with the healthcare center. It's actually paying for a portion of the shelters. So pretty interesting partnership there.
Great, thanks, Andy. So, as up front in the design process, it's really important to understand the permissions and approvals and agreements that you might need, whether it's from the state DOT, the municipality, or a private property owner. And also think about ongoing and routine maintenance and what partners might be available to help with, whether it's emptying the trash or replacing signs or the seasonal snow shoveling. Part 3 of the guide is bus stop typology and presents 8 bus stop typologies or graphical renderings and notes regarding design treatments for some bus stop configurations. The typologies reflect different community contexts and different levels of supportive infrastructure. The typologies do not cover every type of bus stop. They don't cover every aspect of the design, but they highlight some of the common elements as well as design considerations. And since each bus stop is unique, it's important, again, to coordinate with the municipality, the transit agency, the DOT on everything from the bus stop placement, configuration, and those key design elements. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Rich to close out with some of our key takeaways from the presentation.
Thank you. So it does have, finding a bus stop champion, typically it's the transit authority, but also trying to find a sympathetic or empathetic township official or staff person at a particular location where you're trying to go to, having them participate in the development and get them excited about what you're trying to bring to their property is really important. At the Stroud Mall, I had the Stroud Mall mall manager. He was very helpful in getting all the sign-offs that we need from their corporation and working with the other partners to get that done. At the Pocono Country Place, it was actually some of the residents who really demanded having the bus shelters. And so there was a lot of pushback from the board because they didn't really want to have the shelters there. But when enough people stepped up and said they really wanted to see them, that's when that came through. So having champions, not only at the agency, but also on the street level is very important. Starting small is really, really important. Starting small, starting easy, find the low-hanging fruit. Those shelters or those amenities will be acceptable to the place that you're looking to place them, and show other partners what you've done and how you've worked to improve those areas. Proactive planning is critical. Being able to go to the township planning commission, the township zoning hearing board, the township borough manager, and all of those organizations involved with that is critical. And building strategic partnerships. I personally serve on the county planning commission, so I'm able to work with the county planning staff to help them promote the model ordinance and how to encourage those other townships to develop their saldo so it reflects the things that we need. And your MPO is useful as well. Because we're both a rural and urban area, we have to kind of straddle both of those worlds. And then seek opportunities to integrate improvements with other projects. Downtown Stroudsburg is going to be looking at a complete streets program, and we're part of that project to help them identify those places that are, the right fit for bus shelters, bike racks, and other amenities that our transit users will need to take the bus in their community. So by involving all of the partners, it's the way to get things done. No transit authorities are just going to be able to say, oh, well, let's put a bus shelter there and it automatically appear. There's a lot of work that goes into that to get that done. So thanks.
So that is the end of our formal presentation. And I think we've allowed a little bit of time for some questions and answers. And I just peeked at the chat and I know there's a couple of in there. So Kara, do you want to help guide us through that Q&A?
Absolutely. First, I want to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful presentation that already answered so many questions. And I'm sure after this, everybody's just going to go right to the link for the guide, and we'll have that very soon on our website. So first, we're going to take the questions that were asked in the chat. And as for the sound issue, that was resolved. And when we post the recording, we will also post it on YouTube so you can have a transcript if you missed any of the beginning sound. So, okay. The first question we have is about solar light. Have any of you in your bus stop planning used this type of light to light shelters, and any ideas about it?
So when we build our shelter, when we put in our shelters, we add solar lighting to them. The panels have to be checked every once in a while. The battery for sure has to be checked every, they eventually die on you. And the technology 10 years ago is not as good as the technology is today. So you'll need to work on some upgrades over the course of 5 or 10 years.
Thank you, Rich. Okay. Yes, I mean, technology is really important to think about at every aspect of a planning project, especially with something like bus stops. And the next question is about easement management. A little long question. Asking about easement management and how it relates to shelter maintenance and snow clearance. The person asked, does the agency can the agency typically take responsibility, or does an established memorandum of understanding dictate that the adjacent property owner must contribute to maintenance and execute snow clearance? I know that in your presentation, you were talking about in the planning process, you decide who will do maintenance, but any other information on that?
We typically build that the agreement, we call it a license agreement. So we have a license to use the property. And with most of the places that we've been at this point, the location that we site the shelter, they're responsible for ice, snow, and debris, garbage around the shelter. We'll go in every 6 months or so, depending on wintertime conditions, and clean out the inside of it. We have a pressure washer and other material that will go in and clean the shelters. But we typically try to push that back onto the property owner, since they have staff right there to do the work. So that's typically how we've been handling that.
Okay, so that's a good example. And what I've heard in the presentation is it's different for every type of project too. Okay, the next question, somebody asked for examples of hold harmless agreements to put a shelter in a location. Does the guide have anything about that, or where would be a good place to find that out?
I can say the guide does not have that, but as part of the ongoing work, that is an issue and a question that we've received from other participants in other training programs. So I know that that's a need out there. Rich or Andy, do you have any thoughts?
I'll jump in and say that we include that as part of our lease agreement or agreement with the property owner. We typically try to cover that, so that takes the liability off of the property owner. So we include that bus shelter as part of the shelter and that area as part of our risk for the transit authority. That's just one way to do it, and that helps the property owner feel a little more comfortable about placing the shelter there.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Also, when people are asking for examples and templates, that's a question we often get at National RTAP through our resource center that we are able to help people with. So if people would like to know that, including who originally asked it or anybody else, please send an email to info@nationalrtap.org, and I will see if there are samples or templates of hold harmless agreements. And I'll also send them to Natasha if you are looking for something for the next guide. So the next question, and it was answered, so it might be you, Rich. Somebody asked which of the panelists worked on the e-ink and shelter designs.
No, I did that, yes.
Great. And I saw you did put your contact information in the chat, and it's also on this page, which again will be posted on our website. Okay, now somebody asked, and yes, this was covered, how an organization could go about getting funding to help with this issue. There are several FTA grants currently available, and there's still COVID CARES Act type of funding. There's a lot of different funding available. One way to find out the latest funding is to subscribe to National RTAP e-news. Go to our website, nationalrtap.org, click on news and sign up. We put every national funding opportunity we can in our website. And you can also reach out to info@nationalrtap.org if you're looking for funding sources. Will this PowerPoint be forwarded to attendees? Yes, it will be by tomorrow. Okay, so this is an interesting one. Somebody wanted to know the best strategies for bus stops if a project already began and didn't consider the bus stop infrastructure at the onset of the project. Who wants to talk about that? You're in the middle of a project and all of a sudden you realize you need a bus stop or different bus stops. How do you?
You call Andy, you find, you know who your champions are, I think that is one key. And that's, again, why it's important to establish those champions up front, because, and establishing your army of champions, really, the more people that know you're interested in improving bus stops and bus stops are important to your transit agency or your community, the more success you'll have. And, I think Rich has seen this. He's talked to his county planning agency staff and he's gotten them on board. And again, that doesn't answer the question, but I think that's one of the keys is to have that. I think one of the things is see what can be done. Designs are constantly evolving. As an engineer, we are always coming up with something new and unexpected. And so it's not unusual for in the middle of a design process, someone to come and say, I didn't know there was that utility buried under the ground, or I didn't know that the right-of-way line was here and not there. And so I think, you know, saying, hey, we need to think about a bus stop isn't an unusual part of a design process if it wasn't considered up front. So I think the first start is to ask. And I think the second thing is to figure out what can be done. Maybe you don't need a shelter or a bench, but you can get the connecting pedestrian infrastructure, or you can get, again, reserving right-of-way or space for the future, so that when maybe other funds or other opportunities become available, it's a little bit easier. So I think those would be some of the strategies I would think of.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and that was one of the reasons this guide was created. I can't tell you how many times in Pennsylvania we get a phone call that a warehouse is opening or a distribution center is opening, and 3 weeks after they open, they're making a phone call that they can't get buses in, they can't get employees to work. What do we do now? So that's part of this. Start early, get those relationships built, and you know, really make sure they're incorporating it from the beginning.
Okay, now we have 1 minute to go and 8 more questions. So what we do in these situations is we post a Q&A document on our website next to the recording and the PowerPoint. And I will forward the remaining questions to the panelists, get answers for you. And we're sorry we did not have enough time to verbally address all of your questions, but we do want to definitely thank Andy, Natasha, and Rich for this amazing presentation. And we also want to thank our audience for your great questions and your participation. And let's go out and build some better bus stops. Thank you all. Have a great rest of day.